Okay, so yesterday, this is what we did for our first example, which is now done. We're going to today start our second example. Real quick review. Inside of main, we said, I want you to build me something called a graphics 1. So it's going to build this so it says, okay, you got to define what this class is. So we did. We said, this is what a graphics 1 is. A graphics 1 is a J-frame through inheritance. So it knows it's going to be building one of those J-frame type things on whatever computer system, Mac or PC it's running on. It knows that, okay? Then we gave this thing 3 properties. We said, I want you to include a label called LBL display, another label called IMG picture, and this thing called a container object. And the container object is going to be this invisible thing. I'm later going to show you how you actually can avoid even coding that. There are ways you can kind of do that once you get a little more comfortable with this. Okay? The first 2 lines of our constructor when we build this thing, and again, we know this from our methods unit that this is a constructor method for building the class. We say, okay, we assign the container what's inside of this being the J-frame. We set the layout of this container to be what's called a flow layout. We explored different ones yesterday, but that'll just determine where these things are placed. We then instantiate the 2 label objects. We create memory for them, so they're built into memory. We set the text of the first one. We set an icon for the second one, so we know the second one's going to contain a picture. And then we call the add method with the container, which would then add those 2 things onto our J label. So they are, our J frame. In whatever position it thinks they should go into when it flows them into there. We then set a bunch of properties for this. This again being the J frame. Saying, here's what size it should be. It should be 500 by 500. Okay? It should be visible. It should allow the user to resize it if they need to. Okay? It should have a title written up here. And we set it so that if the user tries to close this thing, if they hit the red X, the whole program should shut down. So that's what the set of instructions was when we built up this graphics 1 object. You are working with code that other people have written, but using techniques that you are familiar with. Things like methods and parameters and constructors. Yeah, it takes a little getting used to using somebody else's code, but you're using it in a style that you yourself are used to from the previous units that we did here in grade 11. And that's why I do graphics last. It kind of has a clear understanding, hopefully, of what's going on here. Okay, so now we're going to do our second example. So we're going to make something called graphics 2 equals a new graphics 2. Okay? So we made a graphics 1, now we're going to make a graphics 2. So you can use the light bulb if you want to make this class. So go ahead and create the class graphics 2. And make sure you make it in the package. We'll talk a little bit about what that second option is a little bit later in this unit. Okay, so now we have another class called graphics 2. And NetBeans will build it for us. You don't have to use the light bulb. What I usually recommend as well is that you key the keyword public in. It's not entirely necessary, but it's a good programming practice. And on this line, the class signature line, we're also going to, once again, extends J-frame. So graphics 2 will also be a J-frame. And we'll have to import that so that it works. Okay? So just like in our previous example, when we start using graphics, the lines up here for imports are going to get bigger and bigger because you're going to start bringing in other code, including eventually your own code. You'll be importing your own stuff into that. Okay. So let's make some properties for this class. They'll be private. Okay. We're going to make a JLabel like we did before. And we're going to call it LBL answer. We're going to make a calculator, a simple, very simple calculator. Okay? So you have to import JLabel. So we'll do that. Now, we're going to be getting input from our users for this calculator, but not through JOption pane. So we're going to make a private, holy, that almost was the word pirate there. Private J, it's called the JText, and not area, JText field. This is essentially a text box, input box, the text field. And we'll call it txt number 1, because we're going to do 2 of these. And then make a second one called number 2. So we have 2 text boxes. We have a label where the answer is going to go, 2 text boxes where we'll input one number and then another number. And now we'll have a button, a private JButton that we're just going to call BUT or BTN, button add. So that will be the button that will add the 2 numbers together, and the answer will go in the label. It's going to be a very simple design. And then lastly, just like in the previous one, we will have a container object that we'll just call container. And that will be imported from a different library. Okay, so if you look up here at your imports, you should have 5 import lines right now. So what this thing's going to look like, if I just draw it out for you, what I'm intending it to look like, is it's going to be a JFrame that's going to have a text box, a button for adding, another text box, and then a little label where the answer goes. So like the user can put 2 here, can put a 2 there. When they click the button, a 4 will appear there. A very simple calculator. Okay? But we're going to do it in this Java style using all code as the design technique. Okay? So those are the things we need. Now let's make our constructor. So when we construct a graphics2, what are some of the things that we need to do? Well, some of these lines you can actually copy over from our previous example, but I'm going to type them. First thing is our container will come from this.getContentPane. That is a method call that will pull out the container from the JLabel, or sorry, from the JFrame, and stick it and connect it to the container. Then we will say container.setLayout. This is what we did last class. We set the layout so that it will position things. And again, we use the new flow layouts. Okay, so those are the first 2 lines. And again, you can just copy and paste those from the previous example if you want. Exact same 2 lines of code. Okay, we'll leave a little room. And we'll also use the same kind of lines as the previous one. This dot set size. And I'm going to suggest 2 sizes to you guys. It's 350, comma, by 75. That's going to be the size I'm going to suggest. This dot set visible will be true. It'll be visible, absolutely. This dot set title. Whoops. So give it a title like graphics2. You could even just call it calculator if you want. This dot set resizable. I'm going to set this to false. I'm not going to let them resize this one. And this dot set default close operation to jframe dot exit on close. Now again, if you are having trouble with the autocomplete features, just copy and paste those lines from the previous example. They're right there. The only thing you would have to change is the size and maybe the title, but the other lines would be basically the same. Okay? So now if you want, we don't have these things on our J-frame, but you can actually run this right now, and you should see both J-frames will appear. Our one from our previous example, yes, and this other one now is there, and at least the size is set up. It's got nothing on it yet, but it's ready to have something be placed on it. Now remember, we have it set up so that if you close either of these, the whole program shuts down. Okay. Any questions about this so far? This is basically just a review of the first one. Okay, so now we got to instantiate all these objects. So we'll start with txt number 1 equals a new J text field. And here are the constructor options with the text field object. You can construct one just default. You can make it blank. You can construct a text box with text inside of it. And both of those first two are not what we're going to be looking for. Because the default one makes it so small, you can't really even see it. The second one would already put text in there, and I don't want to do that. I want to let the user type something in the text box. It's actually this third one, which uses an integer as a parameter, that just determines basically how many columns wide it should be. So I'm going to use that one. In other words, I'm just going to put a 5 in there. Okay, and we'll see what that does. And then go ahead and repeat that for txt number 2, same way. So it'll be a new text field. LBL answer will be equal to a new J label. Come on. And for that one, we could use the default constructor, but I'm just going to put a little bit of blanks in there, just as a spot for the answer to go. Or maybe I'll just put actually maybe what I'll do is I'll just put like an equal sign in there or something like that. There we go, something like that. And then I'm going to make my button for add equal to a new J button. Okay, here are the constructor options for J buttons. The reason I'm doing this example is this is where it gets, again, a little more complicated. How to make buttons work. Because think about this is the way we did things in grade 10. I started with you guys just making designs, but once your programs actually started doing stuff, like responding to actions, it got a little more complicated. So here are the default constructors for button. You can make a blank one. You can make one with an icon. You can make one with text in it. You can make one with text and an icon, so buttons can have pictures on them. Sure, that makes sense. But it's the second one that implies there's something else going on there. There's something called an action associated with a button, which makes sense, right? We use buttons for that purpose. So we'll get into that in a minute. For now, let's just put something like a plus symbol inside the button. A little bit of space on either side. Okay, so that creates our 4 objects. Let's now add those to the container. Container.add and like txt number 1. Add number 2. Add the label. Boy, copy and paste can be your friend some days, I tell you. And add button add. So I'm going to add those 4 things to my container. Now I could go ahead and try and run this. And now you should see the 4 objects on your design. But notice something about it. Notice the way they are drawn on here. It draws a text box, the label, and the button flowing together. The reason why it draws them in that order is because that's the order we told it to draw it in. So it's basically that simple. If I, for example, wanted the plus button in between the two text boxes, I could just switch the order of these lines of code. So now when I run it, where is it? Notice now the button is in between the text boxes. I like that. That looks a little bit better. So let me just pause there for a second and make sure everyone's got all that so far, okay? So what we did was we instantiated our properties. Remember, properties are things within the class. And instantiated means it gives it memory. In other words, it brings it into existence. So that's when we instantiated these things using their constructor methods. These are their constructors. Then, on this line, we add those objects, right? Objects are the properties, of the class. We add those objects to our container, which is a thing that is connected to this being a graphics object, a graphics2 object, which is a JFrame. It's all about giving very specific instructions here. We're adding stuff to a container which is connected to the JFrame object, and it places them according to a layout that we have defined. We've defined the way it lays it out. So that's what's going on there. That's the stuff that's making this happen. The last piece is now how to get that button actually working. Right now it's not. So I think I'm going to stop for today just because I want to take my time tomorrow really explaining the idea of the button because it is kind of tricky. But I thought what I could possibly do today with these about 5 minutes left is show you how you don't have to use flow layout. Flow layout is great, but let's say I made it was resizable. So again, go away, peanut butter jelly guy. If I resize this, it's sure it's flowing stuff to new spots, but look, notice again if I make it really small, it's really piling stuff up and making stuff crazy. So I'm going to set this back to false. And what I'm going to do is instead of using a flow layout like this, I'm just going to use the word null, which essentially says to the container, you know what? I'm not going to tell you where to put stuff. I'm not going to put anything anywhere. So notice how it basically makes things disappear. Okay? Now, what I have to do is after I add things to the container, I have to tell the things where to go. And I actually have to do it afterwards. So I can say txt number1 dot, and it's set.
Yes, me.
Hello? Okay, so. Yeah. Yeah. All right, so anyways, what I could, you're confusing the grade 11s now. All right, so what I'm going to do now is set, and what I'm looking for here is there's a couple ways you can set its position. The one I would recommend is this one called set bounds. And you can see what it asks for. It asks for the x, the y, the width, and the height when you set it there. So for example, I can use that set bounds, and I can say exactly where I want that text box to go. So for example, I could say I want you at position 0, 10. So that's x, or maybe I'll put it at 10, 10. And I want it to be 50 by, 50, right? Like I specifically am in charge of how it places text box 1. So now you can see right there, that's what it did. It put it at spot 50, 50, or sorry, at spot 10, 10 at 50, 50. So this is going to take a little bit of playing around with now to get it exactly where you'd want it to be. Okay? But the nice thing about setting the bounds that way is it's now locked into that spot. So if I resize this, notice it ain't moving around. It is locked in there. It is not going to move. Okay? So Maybe the height should be a little bit less, 50 by 20. That might be a little bit better. There we go. So that works out a little bit better. And then maybe I want to take button add dot set bounds. And maybe I want to put it at, well, its x would be the 10 plus the 50 plus a little bit more, so maybe 80. Its y, maybe I'll keep it at 10. And maybe it should be 50 by 20 as well. Let's see how that looks. So here's the problem with being totally in charge is now you got to play around with those numbers a little bit. What I showed you guys yesterday is you can use that designer coming up. It'll do a lot of that work for you if you want, which is what C# did, which is very handy in some cases. But there I've now placed that button. Maybe its X is a little too far over. So maybe 80 was a little too much. Maybe I should have went with 60. Let's see how that looks. That's too close maybe, or maybe I'm okay with that. I'll go one more over, 70. And then maybe I'll set the bounds for txt number 2. So it's going to be maybe at spot 70 plus the 50. So that's 120 plus another 10, maybe 130. And I'll try that. Okay, that looks good. And then maybe I now want to set the bounds of LBL answer. And I'll set the bounds. So for this one, it'll be the 130 plus the 50. That's 180 plus another 10, 190 at 10, 50, 20. So let's see how that looks. So that looks pretty good right there, just like that. Maybe now I want to shrink my whole design a little bit. So maybe the 350 is a little bit too big. Maybe I want to go 310. See how that looks. Still too big. Let's make it 280. So it's a lot of playing with number values to kind of get things exactly kind of the way you want it to be at this point. But that's another way you can create layouts. So there, you can see now I got this mini calculator, and even if I resize it, it's not moving those objects around. Then, of course, I can take the resizable away from my user. So that's another thing you can do in addition to using the flow layout, is you can set layouts to be null values.